So I'm just going to dive right in and ask you about when you first fell in love with verse.
It's sort of a complicated answer because it wasn't straightforward, Gabriella. I was a student at the Vermont College of Fine Arts and getting my MFA in writing for children and young adults. And I entered the program with 30 published books, fiction, nonfiction. The one genre I had not attempted was a verse novel. And as you know, the instructors in that program, they really encourage the learners to push the creative envelope. Well, one semester I was home and I was cleaning out my office and I came across a box, an old tattered shoe box full of letters I had written to a friend and he had written to me, and I saved his letters. He was a Marine in Vietnam in the 1960s, and I was his pen pal. Well, I sat down and I read through his letters. I was blown away. I mean, I could not believe some of the things that this kid, you know, an 18, 19-year-old, had experienced during his tour in Vietnam. And I really felt compelled to do something with the letters, to tell the story. And I began scribbling notes that had to do with my other friends during that time. And these memories just started assaulting me. It was like flashbacks. And I decided that I really wanted to honor him and his story. And to do so, I decided that his letters, that form, letter writing, would be the way he would express himself in the book. We communicated through journal entries and letters that we would write each other in class, and so I just started playing around with form. At that time, I did the research into novels in verse. Purple Days was very complicated because I ended up with 6 viewpoint characters, and each character had to have his or her own story arc with a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end, and yet all 6 stories had to weave together to make a compelling whole. Now, in a traditional novel, I think the idea for a story and characters comes to me kind of together. It's not clearly defined though. In the beginning, it's just sort of this mishmash of I have sort of an idea for main characters and I have sort of an idea for a story and a plot. I do not outline, and so I suffer greatly through a first draft trying to make this mess somehow cohesive. With my last novel, Ice Island, it just came out with Random House, and it's middle grade. It's an Alaskan-based adventure, and I actually wrote that first draft as part of the Nano Month, and so that was really freeing for me because in 1 month I had a draft. As ugly as it was, at least it was down on paper. And I'm one of those writers who really suffers through an early draft because I have that editor on my shoulder. And, you know, first drafts are always so ugly. And you know, I just think, oh my gosh, I can't remember how to write a novel. I've forgotten everything I ever knew. And I go through that every single time. When I was forced to just sit there and add up words each day, I couldn't second guess myself. I just had to go through it. And I didn't have time to go back and read what I had written. And much of that was thrown out. But at least I had the story structure, and it really wasn't, the shape wasn't as bad as what you would imagine. And so that book was actually written much quicker than the others.
In terms of time, how long does it usually take?
Every project is different. Purple Days I worked on for 3 or 4 years. Ice Island was about a year.
Mhm.
And a year on a novel for me is very quick. I'm a slow writer. I'm just one of those people, you know, even with the butt in the chair, it takes me quite a while to hammer it out.
You talked a lot about how that first draft is kind of ugly. So, how do you go about the process of taking this ugly first draft and turning it into a polished, beautiful story where you're juggling 6 different storylines, 6 different characters, and they all have a beginning, middle, and end? I mean, how do you juggle all of that and edit it into that form?
One of the things that I do that I found very helpful is in that second rewrite, I take the book and I break it up into thirds. So I just work on the beginning third, and I shape that, and then I go to the middle third, and then I go to the last third, and then the next revision I break it down even further. You know, I'll take one chapter and I look at it as a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then I do that with every scene. So as I'm going through, I'm defining and honing and shaping smaller and smaller portions. And then that very last revision, or the very last two, I'm looking at every sentence, I'm looking at every word. So, you know, it just goes from this great big entity down and down and down. And I think that's how most writers, they refine, you know, just down to the word, down to the very syllable.
You have a talent for taking true stories and turning them into fiction or novels. What you talked a little bit about the story behind Purple Days, but how much of it is true and how much of it did you make up?
Oh, you really want me to answer that question? I mean, like with any story, you take what's real and you twist it, but there's a lot of things in the book that are true.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I really did shave between my eyebrows because I wasn't allowed to pluck my eyebrows. Cheryl sneaks out her window in the middle of the night, mm-hmm. and if you go back to my childhood home, you will see a hook and an eye on the outside of my bedroom door, and that was my parents' attempt to keep me in, but like any red-blooded teenager, you know, I just went out the window. I did interview a lot of Vietnam veterans. I heard one guy, he said that he chose his truck. He was driving a 5,000-gallon fuel tanker in Vietnam over landmines, and he chose his truck because there was a bullet hole in the door, and he thought it was a lucky bullet hole. And another guy put a condom over the muzzle of his gun to keep out the moisture, because as you know, Vietnam is so humid, to keep his gun from rusting, and yet he could shoot through a condom. And I thought, wow, that has to go in the book. So I took details from history, from research, from interviews, and put those in. And then I drew on my own experience. So it really is. I mean, it's all true. Maybe it all didn't really happen, though. I started writing when my children were very young. I was lucky to be a stay-at-home mom. And it was something I could do at home so my brain wouldn't turn into strained carrots. But I was not writing for children then. I was writing very short articles for magazines and newspapers. And then when my children were older, and my one daughter was reading Judy Blume. And those books are so funny, and they're so wonderful, and they're so full of heart and emotion. And I thought, gosh, this would really be fun. And so I tried my hand on it, and I wrote a complete novel that did not sell, but I had wonderful rejection letters. In fact, I had an entire wall in my den that was corkboard, and I would press every rejection up there. I covered that entire wall. And but I was encouraged, and I did not at that time have a writing community. Mm-hmm. and I didn't have a critique group, but I did join the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators very early, and that was the smartest thing I ever did. And I started going to conferences, and it just evolved into that audience. The reason I decided to get an MFA had to do with me being bored with my own writing, and I needed some type of stimulation and some type of push, and the MFA program certainly did provide that.
Do you have any advice that you would give to a writer who would like the MFA experience, but just for whatever reason they can't do it?
The first thing off the top of my head, Gabriella, would be just to find a really great critique group. In our writing program, we were required to submit work on a regular basis for feedback. I would really look for writers who not only have experience with story and structure and character, but also who would be honest. I think in a lot of critique groups what happens is you're together for so long and you're such good friends that sometimes you tiptoe around issues because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. I think you can give honest feedback in a way that it's constructive without being hurtful. So I would look for people in my community that would fit that sort of definition.
What kind of advice do you have in terms of like reading and how to engage with the literature?
I think they could all share the books that they're reading, and depending on the genre they're in, just share titles and work up lists of books, and they could even make that part of their discussion. They could critique other people's published literature as well, and they could talk about what works, what doesn't work.
What's on your bedside table right now? What are you reading?
Well, actually, when I'm polishing a manuscript, I try not to read other people's novels. So right now I'm reading The New Yorker.
And can you give us a hint or two about what you're working on right now?
Well, I could say a little bit. It's young adult, and it's totally different from anything I've written. I would say One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest meets Love Story.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for being here today and for sharing all of this great information. And it's been so great to meet you.
It's been wonderful meeting you too, Gabriella. And best of luck to everyone out there who's writing and has a love of creativity. And you just keep doing it. And if you feel that corkboard wall with projections, that's a badge of courage. And so just keep on writing.